The reading of the will was set for 11, in the long gallery at Wexcombe Hall, and Charlotte Reed had been told, in the smallest possible words, that she need not sit. She stood instead at the back of the room near the cold end where the morning had not yet reached, in the grey wool gown she had worn to bury her uncle 3 days before, while the family arranged themselves in the good chairs near the fire. Her uncle's solicitor laid out his papers on the gallery table. Her cousin Julian Reed sat at the head of them all, with his boots crossed at the ankle, and his face already wearing the expression of a man who has been told the ending of a story he finds agreeable. The Dowager Lady Marbury, her late uncle's sister, sat at his right hand, with her fan held a careful half-inch too high, and when her gaze passed over Charlotte at the cold end of the gallery, it did not stop. To the family gathered in those chairs, Charlotte was the poor relation, the orphaned niece, who had kept the old man's accounts and read to him in his last winter, and would now be turned out with whatever small kindness the new master chose to spare. None of them looked at the document still sealed in the solicitor's case. None of them knew that her uncle had called her to his bedside in February, pressed a cold key into her hand, and said a thing she had not yet repeated to a single soul. If this is the kind of story you keep returning to, the kind where the world's verdict on a woman is not the final verdict, stay close and let it unfold the way it was meant to. Charlotte had come to Wexcombe Hall at 17 after the fever took both her parents in a single hard fortnight, and her Uncle Edmund had taken her in with the brusque awkwardness of a man who had never learned how to be tender and was too honest to pretend otherwise. He had not embraced her. He had shown her the library instead, the long room with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and its tall windows looking out over the south lawn, and he had said that a person who could not find company in books would find it nowhere worth having. She had been 24 for 2 months. In the 7 years between, she had become the thing the household could not run without, and the thing the household never named. She kept the accounts in her small, neat hand, because her uncle's eyes had failed him. She wrote his letters and read him his correspondence, and sat with him through the long evenings when the gout kept him from sleep. She knew which tenants were behind on their rents and why, and which of those reasons were honest. She knew the estate the way one knows a body one has nursed, and it had become the only home her grief could find. The family did not see any of that. They saw a plain young woman in a retrimmed gown, who had been clever enough to make herself useful to a rich old man, and they had decided, with the easy certainty of people who have never had to earn a roof, what such a woman was owed. Lady Marbury had said it plainly enough at the funeral, in the carriage, in a voice not meant to carry but carrying all the same. "The girl has done well for herself these 7 years," she had said, "and now the doing is finished." Charlotte had heard it through the carriage window as she stood in the churchyard rain, and she had folded the words away the way she folded everything, out of sight, where it could not be used against her. Julian had arrived 2 days before the funeral from London, in a coat that cost more than the whole of the home farm brought in a season. He was her uncle's nephew on the brother's side, a young man of 8 and 20, who had visited Wexcombe perhaps 4 times in Charlotte's 7 years there, each visit shorter than the last, each ending in a quiet request for money her uncle granted, and then, in the privacy of the study, regretted aloud. Julian moved through the hall now as if measuring it for sale. He had already spoken to the steward about which of the horses might be sent to Tattersall's. He had stood in the library, her library, with his hands in his pockets, and remarked that the room would make a fine billiard room once the shelves were cleared. Charlotte had said nothing. She had learned that the cost of speech for a woman in her position was always paid by the woman. The man at the gallery's far window had said nothing either, and Charlotte had not at first understood why he was there. He stood apart from the family near the tall glass, a tall man with dark hair and a coat of deep navy, cut close and plain, his hands clasped behind him, and his attention fixed on something out on the south lawn that no one else could see. She had taken him at first for a creditor's man or a surveyor Julian had summoned to value the timber. The solicitor had not introduced him. When the dowager's voice rose in some small complaint about the cold, the man at the window turned his head only slightly, and his eyes had found Charlotte at the cold end of the room, and rested on her for the length of one breath before returning to the lawn. There was nothing in the look she could have named. It was not pity. Pity she knew the shape of by now. It was closer to recognition, as though he had been looking for a particular face in the room and had found it where he expected, at the back, in the gray gown, in the cold. Mr. Holloway. The solicitor cleared his throat and broke the seal. His name, Charlotte would learn within the half-hour, was the Duke of Ashcombe, and his estate marched with Wexcombe's eastern boundary for 3 miles, though her uncle had never once spoken of him in all the years she kept his correspondence. That silence, she would come to understand, had a reason in it. For now she knew only that a duke stood at the window of a country squire's gallery on the morning his will was read, and that his presence had made the solicitor nervous in a way the family's grand impatience had not. Mr. Turber. Holloway began with the small bequests, the way such things are always begun, and the room arranged its patience accordingly. To the housekeeper, Mrs. Statter. Pell, who had served at Wexcombe 40 years, a sum of £50, and the cottage at the lane's end. For her natural life, Charlotte saw Mrs. Pell's hand tighten on her apron at the back of the room, near where Charlotte herself stood, and the two women did not look at each other, because to look would have been to risk something neither could afford to spend in that company. To the steward, a sum and a recommendation. To the parish, a sum for the poor. What? Julian shifted in his chair, and recrossed his boots, and let his impatience show at the corner of his mouth, because these were the leavings, the small change of a great estate. And he had come for the estate itself. Then Mr. Blanks. Holloway turned a page, and his voice changed, and Charlotte felt the change in it before she understood the words, the way one feels a coming weather. To my nephew, Julian Edmund Reed, the solicitor read, I leave the sum of £500 in the hope that it may be the last sum he has occasion to ask of his family, and the wish that he may learn what I was never able to teach him. The gallery went very still. Julian's face did not move at first, as though the sentence had been spoken in a language he was waiting to have translated. £500 was not nothing. It was not Wexcombe Hall, and it was not the home farm, and it was not the 3,000 acres and the timber and the rent, and every soul in the room understood, in the same instant, that the sentence had been built precisely so that no one could mistake what it did not contain. Lady Marbury's fan stopped. It was Julian who spoke first, and he spoke the way such men always speak when the ground moves under them, with a laugh meant to put the floor back. There has been some error, he said, half rising. My uncle and I discussed the succession not 18 months ago. He gave me to understand the Hall would come to me. He looked at the solicitor, and then, when the solicitor only held his papers and said nothing, he looked at the man at the window, the Duke, as though a peer of the realm might be appealed to as a natural ally against the indignity of a clerk's mistake. The Duke did not move. His eyes had returned to Charlotte, and this time they did not leave her, and Charlotte, who could feel the weight of that attention across the whole length of the cold gallery, kept her own eyes fixed on the solicitor's hands, and willed her face to show nothing at all. There is no error, Mr. Holloway said, if your lordship and the family will permit me to continue, he continued. And the room learned, sentence by careful sentence, what her uncle had built in the last year of his life, with his eyes failing and his niece's hand guiding the pen. The whole of the estate, the hall, the home farm, the woods, the cottages, the rents, the entire body of the property not otherwise bequeathed, was left in its entirety to his niece, Charlotte Ann Reed, who had been to him, the will said, the plain words he had dictated, and she had written down without, at the time, understanding that she was writing her own name. More a daughter than a niece, and the only person beneath his roof who had ever loved the place for itself, and not for what it might be sold to become. Charlotte did not hear the rest. There was a sound in her ears like the sea in a shell, and the cold gallery tilted very slightly, and she put one gloved hand against the paneled wall to steady herself, and across the room the Duke took a single step toward her before he stopped himself. and no one saw it but her, and she did not understand it. "Be seated, Miss Reed," the Duke said. His voice was low and level, and carried without effort to the back of the room. "You have had a shock. It was not a kindness exactly. It was a command." There was a chair behind her that she had not noticed. Mrs. Well, Pell's doing pushed quietly into the reach of her hand, and Charlotte sat in it because her legs had stopped consulting her, and the Duke looked away again as though he had done nothing more than remark upon the weather. And Lady Marbury's gaze moved between the seated girl and the standing peer with the first flicker of a new and unwelcome calculation behind her eyes. The reading finished. The witnesses were named. The thing was done and sealed and legal. And Julian Reed stood in the middle of the long gallery of the house he had come to inherit and found himself holding £500 and a sentence about what his uncle had failed to teach him. And the change in him was not loud. That was the frightening part. He did not rage. He grew quiet, and he looked at Charlotte for a long moment across the room, and then he looked at the Duke, and something arranged itself behind his face, some plan finding its first footing. And he said, in a voice gone smooth, that of course the matter must be examined. "A will dictated by a blind old man," he said to the very woman who profited by it, the very woman who held the pen. He said it gently. He said it as a man says a thing he intends to make the world believe. And the Dowager Lady Marbury, who a quarter-hour before had not troubled to let her gaze rest on her niece, now turned her full attention upon Charlotte with the slow interest of a woman who has found a use for someone she had meant to discard. That was the first day. There would be many days after it. And Charlotte, who had inherited a house and a name and 3,000 acres in the space of a single morning, understood already, in her body before her mind would frame it, that the inheriting was going to be the easy part. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead in the library, that was now hers and did not feel hers, in the chair her uncle had used, and she took the cold iron key from the ribbon at her throat where she had carried it since February, and turned it over in her fingers in the firelight. He had pressed it into her hand on one of the bad nights, when the pain had made him plain and urgent in a way the day never did. "There is a thing you will need," he had said, "when the time comes. The drawer in the muniment room, the low one, the one that sticks. You will know it, because you are the only one who has ever bothered to know anything in this house." And he had closed her fingers over the key, and would say no more. And within the month, his speech had begun to fail, and she had not had the chance to ask him what she would find. She had not gone to the muniment room yet. There had not been an hour she was unobserved. Julian had taken to walking the corridors at odd times, and Lady Marbury had installed herself in the best guest chamber, and showed no sign of leaving, and the household, sensing the ground shifting, had grown watchful in the way households do. The key was warm now from her hand, and the question her uncle had left her was the only thing in the whole grief-blurred week that felt like a task she could actually perform, and so she folded it away again, and resolved to find her hour. The Duke called the following morning. He left his card, which was the correct thing, and he asked whether Miss Reed was receiving, which was more than the correct thing, given that Miss Reed was a woman alone in a house full of relations who wished her gone. Charlotte received him in the morning room because the drawing room was where Lady Marbury held her court, and the Duke came in out of the thin autumn light and stood for a moment looking at the room, at the worn places in the carpet, and the good light from the east window and the small evidences of a house that had been lived in rather than displayed. And something in his face eased a fraction, as though he had expected worse, and was relieved. "I knew your uncle," he said, when the civilities were past. "Not well. We were not friendly." He paused, and Charlotte waited because she had learned that men of few words say the most important thing in the silence after the first one. "I knew him well enough, though, to know he did not make mistakes with his pen," he went on, "and that whatever this family chooses to say in the coming weeks, he meant every word that was read in that gallery." He looked at her directly. "You should not let them persuade you otherwise." "Why?" Charlotte asked. "Should it matter to your grace what I am persuaded of?" It was not a polite question. She had not meant it to be. She was tired, past politeness, and she had spent 7 years being grateful to people who expected gratitude as their due, and some small flint in her had struck a spark. At last, the Duke did not take offense. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he looked away toward the east window, toward the boundary where his land met hers, and he said only that he had his reasons, and that she would learn them in time, and that until then she would oblige him by eating something, because she had the look of a woman who had not eaten since the funeral, and a person could not fight on an empty stomach. Eat something. Another command. Charlotte found, to her own surprise, that she had rung for the tray before she had decided to, and that the Duke had seen her do it, and that the corner of his mouth had moved in something that was not quite a smile but was the near relation of one. He stayed half an hour. He spoke of the estate as a man speaks who understands estates, of the timber that should not be cut for 3 years yet, whatever Julian's man advised, of the eastern tenants and the drainage and the small practical things no one had ever thought her capable of discussing. And Charlotte, who had managed all of it in secret for years and had never once been permitted to say so aloud at a table, found herself talking, really talking, in sentences that surprised her with their own competence, while the Duke listened with a stillness she did not yet know how to read. When he rose to go, he paused at the door. "There is a man named Crail," he said, "who has done work for your cousin in town. If you see him at Wexcombe, send to me." He gave her no more than that. He bowed correctly over her hand, and his fingers did not linger. And yet Charlotte stood at the morning-room window for a long time after his carriage had gone, her hand still faintly warm where his had touched it through the glove, watching the place on the drive where he had been. The campaign against her began in earnest within the week, and it began, as such things do, in the drawing-rooms of the neighborhood where Lady Marbury had begun to pay calls. Charlotte heard of it sideways through Mrs. Pord. Pell, who heard of it through the servants' hall, which knew everything before the family did. The dowager was telling a particular story, and the story was this: that her poor brother Edmund had gone soft in the mind at the end, that the clever niece had seen her chance, that a will written by the hand that profited from it was no will at all but a theft dressed up in legal clothes, and that the family meant, for the sake of poor Julian, and for the sake of justice, to set it aside. She told it kindly. That was her gift. She told it the way a woman tells a sad truth she takes no pleasure in, and the neighborhood, which had never been given any other version of Charlotte than the plain, useful niece at the old man's elbow, found it easy to believe. "She is a scheming little nobody who flattered a dying man," Lady Marbury said. In the drawing-room at Hartfield, to a circle of ladies who repeated it onward by nightfall. The words came back to Charlotte through Mrs. Beatty. Held 3 days later, and Charlotte received them standing at the muniment room door with the iron key finally in her hand, and she found that they hurt less than she had feared and steadied her, more than she had expected. A scheming little nobody. She turned the words over, the way she had turned the key, and she fitted the key to the low drawer that stuck, and she pulled. The drawer held a single bundle of papers tied in faded green ribbon, and a smaller folded letter sealed with her uncle's ring, addressed in his own labored hand, from the time before his eyes had wholly failed, to Charlotte, to be opened when she is doubted. She did not open the letter then. She heard a footstep in the corridor, Julian's tread. She knew it now, and she slid the drawer shut and locked it, and put the bundle and the letter inside her shawl against her body. And when her cousin put his head into the muniment room and asked, smiling, what she did alone in the cold among the old deeds, she said that she was looking for the drainage records for the eastern fields, which was a thing she knew enough to make convincing, and Julian looked at her a moment too long and withdrew. She did not breathe until his step had faded. Then she carried the papers to her own chamber, and she barred the door, and she sat down on the floor with her back against the bed like a child, and she untied the green ribbon. What she found there she did not at first fully understand, because it was written in the dry language of the law and of money, and it took her the better part of the night to read it through twice and grasp what her uncle had been quietly assembling in the last year of his life. The shape of it, once she saw it, was unmistakable, And it changed everything she thought she knew about why a duke had stood at her uncle's window on the morning the will was read. This is the part the family did not know was coming, and neither did she. Stay with it. The bundle was a record of debts. Julian's debts, gathered patiently from a dozen sources across 2 years. The moneylenders and the gaming houses and the tradesmen. Left unpaid, the sums mounting page on page into figures that made Charlotte's careful steward's mind go cold. Her uncle had known. All the while he had been granting Julian his 500 here and his 1,000 there with that air of private regret. He had been gathering the proof of where it went, and the proof was damning, and at the bottom of the bundle was the thing that made the whole of it suddenly sharp and dangerous. A note in Julian's own hand promising a portion of the Wexcombe estate as security against a debt of £4,000 to a London man. A note written and signed 8 months before his uncle died. A note promising land that was not Julian's to promise against the certain expectation that it soon would be. He had not waited for his uncle to die. He had sold the inheritance before he had it, on the strength of a succession he had been confident of, and the man who held that note would expect to be paid in Wexcombe acres. And now the acres had gone to Charlotte, and Julian's confident arrangement had become, overnight, a fraud with no land beneath it. That was why he needed the will set aside. Not pride, not even greed, exactly. Necessity. If Charlotte held Wexcombe, Julian was ruined and likely worse, for the London man who held his note was not the kind who forgave. And the quickest road back to solvency ran directly through proving that the old man had been incompetent and his niece a thief, so that the estate might revert to the nephew. The law would then favor, and the note be made good. Charlotte understood, sitting on the cold floor of her chamber at 3 in the morning with the candle guttering, that she was not fighting a slight. She was fighting a man with everything to lose, and such men did not stop. She thought of going to the Duke. He had told her to send for him if she saw the man Crail, and she understood now that Crail must be the London man's agent, or her uncle's, or both. Some thread the Duke had hold of from the other end. She did not yet know why the Duke held any thread at all, and her uncle's letter, the one addressed to be opened when she is doubted, still lay sealed on the floorboards beside her, and she had not opened it because some part of her was afraid of what one more revelation might ask of her in a single night. She opened it. Now it was short. Her uncle had never wasted words on paper any more than in life. Charlotte, it said, if you are reading this, you are doubted, and so I will tell you. The thing I could not say while I lived for fear of binding you to it before you chose it freely. Ashcombe is not a stranger to this house. Years ago I did him a great wrong in the matter of his young wife, and a letter I did not send when sending it would have spared her, and he has never asked me to pay for it, which is why the debt has sat so heavy. He is a hard man and a fair one, and the only soul within reach whose word the world will not dare to doubt. When you are doubted, go to him. He has agreed to stand your witness, and he does this not for me, who do not deserve it, but because I asked him to look at you once, only once, and he is a man who, having looked, will not look away. Trust your own hand and his name. They will be enough. Charlotte read it 3 times. The candle went out on the 3rd, and she sat in the dark with her uncle's voice in her ears and the Duke's single step across the gallery suddenly meaning something her tired heart was afraid to let it mean. And outside the window the first gray of morning came up over the south lawn, over her lawn. And she understood that the day coming was the day it would all be decided. She went to him that morning, the green-ribboned bundle wrapped in oilcloth beneath her cloak, walking the 3 miles of the eastern boundary path on foot because she would not order out the carriage and let the household know where she went. The Duke received her without surprise, as though he had been expecting her at exactly that hour, and he listened while she laid the whole of it before him. The debts, the note promising land Julian did not own, her uncle's letter, all of it. In the level competent sentences she had not known she possessed until he had first sat in her morning room and listened as though she were worth listening to. He did not interrupt. When she had finished, he was silent for a long moment, and then he said the thing she had not let herself expect. I knew most of it, he said. Not the note. The note is new, and the note changes everything. For it is not merely greed now, but fraud. And fraud is a thing the law will move against, even when it will not move. For a friendless woman, he looked at her across the desk. Your uncle wrote to me before he died and asked me to see you write it if it came to this. I agreed. He paused. I will tell you honestly that I agreed for his sake, and for the sake of an old debt between us, and that I expected to perform a duty and feel nothing. He stopped, and something in his face, the carved stillness she had taken at first for coldness, moved and showed for an instant what lay beneath it. That is not how it has turned out, he said. That is all I will say of it now, because you have a battle to fight today, and you should fight it free of any obligation to me. Yet it is true, and I would not have you go into that room believing I act only from duty. Charlotte did not know what to say, and so she said nothing, and the silence between them across the Duke's desk was the loudest thing she had felt in 7 years. He had not, she would think later, told her his wound in order to be comforted. He had told her, in the spare way of a man, laying down a single stone he had carried alone for a long time, and then he had picked the battle, back up, and gone on. Lady Ashcombe had died young, 4 years before, and the village said it had been a fever, and the Duke had let the village say it. The truth, which Charlotte read in the few words he allowed himself, and the many he did not, was that a letter had gone undelivered at a critical hour, a letter that might have brought her physician a day sooner, and that Edmund Reed had been the man who held that letter and did not send it in time, out of some old quarrel that had seemed to matter, and then had not mattered at all, ever again. The Duke had not forgiven her uncle. He had done something rarer. He had set the debt aside unpaid, carried it, and agreed at last to discharge it, not by punishing the dead man, but by protecting the living girl the dead man had loved. It was the hardest kind of justice there was, and Charlotte, understanding it, understood the man. The thing was decided in the end where it had begun, in the long gallery at Wexcombe Hall 10 days later, before the same family and a good portion of the same neighborhood Lady Marbury had spent those days persuading. Well, Julian had pressed for the gathering himself, confident, believing he held the stronger hand. He had brought a lawyer from town and a physician willing to swear that a blind man of failing health could be led to sign anything, and he had arranged the room as a court with himself the wronged party and Charlotte the accused, and Lady Marbury beside him with her fan and her diamonds and her kind, sorrowful face, ready to deliver to the assembled neighborhood the verdict she had been preparing them to accept. She delivered it, too, when the room had gathered. She rose and she looked at Charlotte standing once more at the cold end of the gallery, and she said in her carrying, sorrowful, perfectly calibrated voice, for the 3rd time and before them all, that the girl was a scheming little nobody who had flattered a dying man out of his senses and his estate, and that it grieved her as the dead man's sister to say so, but that justice grieved sometimes, and said hard things regardless, the gallery murmured. The neighborhood, well prepared, inclined toward the dowager's grief, and Julian's lawyer rose to begin, papers in hand, the smooth machinery of dispossession beginning to turn, and Charlotte felt the old cold rise in her, the pull toward silence, the 7-year habit of letting the cost be paid by the woman, because speech had never once been permitted to help her. Then the door at the far end of the gallery opened, and the Duke of Ashcombe was announced, and the room turned as one body to look, because a duke does not come to a country squire's gallery to watch a niece dispossessed, unless he has come to take a side, and every soul in the room knew it. He crossed the long gallery without hurry. He did not look at Lady Marbury, whose fan had stopped, nor at Julian, whose smooth confidence had gone very still. He crossed the whole length of the room to the cold end where Charlotte stood, and he stopped beside her, and he turned to face the assembled neighborhood, and into the silence that his rank had created, the silence in which a dropped pin would have rung clear. He said the thing that ended it. I stand witness for Miss Reed, and for her uncle's hand. That was all. 8 words, and a duke's whole name behind them. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse Julian. Not yet. Not aloud. He simply placed the entire weight of his rank and his unimpeachable name on Charlotte's side of the scale, in front of the very people who had been assembled to weigh her and find her wanting. And the scale, which the law tilts always toward rank, came down on her side with an almost audible fall. Then he laid the bundle on the gallery table, untied the faded green ribbon, and let the papers speak. The debts. The note in Julian's own hand promising Wexcombe Acres he did not own, 8 months before his uncle died, against £4,000 he could not otherwise pay. The Duke named the London man who held the note. He named the date. He observed in the same level voice that a man who had sold an estate before he inherited it might have a pressing motive to prove the rightful heir a thief, and that the law took a particular interest in promises made against property one did not yet possess. He said it without heat. He did not need heat. He had the papers, and he had his name, and the two together were a weight the room could not argue with. Julian's lawyer set down his own papers very slowly. Julian himself had gone white to the lips, and Lady Marbury, who had built her whole campaign on the certainty that no one of consequence would trouble to defend a friendless girl, looked at the Duke standing at Charlotte's side and understood, all at once and far too late, that she had misread the only thing that mattered, and her fan slipped from her fingers and clattered on the gallery floor. And in the small, terrible sound of it, the neighborhood heard her defeat before she spoke a word of it. She did not finish her sentence. She had no sentence left to finish. It was the physician who broke first, the hired man who had not been paid enough to perjure himself in front of a duke prepared to remember his face, and who allowed, in a sweating mutter, that he had never in fact examined the late Mr. Gran. Read and could not in conscience speak to his competence at all. After that it went quickly, the way such things go once the first stone slides. The neighborhood, which had been so ready to believe the dowager's kind, sad story, discovered with sudden speed that it had always had its doubts. Julian's lawyer requested a private word with his client. Lady Marbury sat down in the good chair near the fire and did not rise from it, and her sorrowful face had nothing left behind it, and no one in the room offered her the smallest comfort, because the room had already turned the way rooms do, toward the rising side. Charlotte felt none of the triumph she might have expected. She felt, standing at the cold end of the gallery with the Duke beside her, and the papers on the table in her uncle's name made clean before the whole neighborhood, only a great quiet, and the Duke's nearness, and the strange new fact of being, after 7 years, seen. The matter was sealed in the weeks that followed by the dull and necessary machinery her uncle had foreseen. Mr. Halloway and the Duke's own solicitor between them made the will proof against any further challenge. The note Julian had signed was put before the magistrates, and Julian, faced with the charge of fraud he could not answer, took the only road left to a man of his kind and went abroad to the continent, where such men go with his £500 and his uncle's wish that he might yet learn what he had never been taught. And Wexcombe saw him no more. Lady Marbury returned to her own establishment, and the small society that would still receive her, and was in the end neither punished nor pursued, only diminished, quietly known by all who mattered to have wagered on cruelty and lost, which for a woman who had built her whole self on standing on the right side of every room was punishment enough. He had told Charlotte he would not crush them past the displacement they had earned, and he did not, and Charlotte found she did not wish him to. Winter came down over Wexcombe in earnest, and the first snow fell on the south lawn in the second week of December, and Charlotte stood at the tall library window and watched it come. The library that was hers now in fact, and at last in feeling, the long room her uncle had shown her at 17 and called the only company worth having. The fire was lit. The accounts were in her own neat hand on the desk, no longer kept in secret, kept in the open now as the mistress of the house keeps them. And on the small table by her chair lay the cold iron key, on its faded ribbon, and beside it unfolded, her uncle's last letter, the one that had told her where to look and whom to trust. And she had not put either away, because some doors, once opened, are meant to be left so. The Duke came most days now, The eastern boundary path between their two houses had been walked so often that winter that the snow could not quite cover it. He had not yet said again the thing he had said across his desk, that what had begun as duty had not stayed duty. But he did not need to say it. Because he came, and he stood at her window looking out over the lawn the way he had stood at her uncle's window on the first morning, and Charlotte had learned at last to read the stillness of him. And what she read there now no longer frightened her. He had asked her, the week before, walking the boundary in the cold, whether she would consent in the spring to making the boundary path a private one between two houses that need no longer be two. He had asked it plainly, in the fewest words, a command almost, except that he had stopped at the end of it and waited. And the waiting had been the whole of his heart laid open, and she had said yes before he finished, and his hand had closed over hers in the snow, and lingered this time, and did not let go. She stood now at the window with that yes still warm in her, and she watched the snow fill the south lawn, and behind her the fire moved in the grate, and on the table the iron key lay quiet at last, its work done. Her uncle had pressed it into her hand on a bad night, and trusted her to find what it opened. She had found it. She had found in the end more than the drawer it fitted. She had found the one room in her life that no one could turn her out of, and the one man who, having looked at her once across a cold gallery, had not looked away. The snow went on falling, soft and certain, over the lawn that was hers, over the house that was hers, over the path that would not stay too. Thank you for staying to the end of Charlotte's story. If it moved you, leave a word and tell me the moment that stayed with you.